Hey guys, welcome to another video here on the AviationPro channel. In this video I'll explain why I prefer Boeing aircraft. So naturally there's always a big debate, which aircraft manufacturer is better, whether it's Boeing, Airbus, or maybe Embraer or Bombardier, for example. And that's completely normal because all these different aircraft types and aircraft manufacturers have different philosophies as to how a cockpit should look, how the system should be operated, and what the role is of the human in the cockpit. Now in this video I will give you 5 reasons why I prefer the Boeing airplanes. Now this is from the perspective of a flight simmer. This has nothing to do with real world aviation per se, just my own flight sim perspective over the years. So don't bash me for that, because in the real world things work out a little bit different than they do in Flight Simulator. Even though we have very high fidelity aircraft add-ons, which are system wise at least very realistic, closely to the real aircraft, there are still other factors that you have to take into account which make it different from the real world. So this video is more there to answer a common question that I get, why don't you fly the Airbus more often, or why don't you fly the Dash 8 or other aircraft type more often instead of the Boeing? Well, in this video I'd like to explain it a little bit and give you my reasons, my personal reasons why I lean more towards Boeing than towards any of those other aircraft types. Now the first reason is pretty simple. I simply grew up with Boeing. Ever since I installed FS2004, in FS2004 the Boeing side of things was more prominently featured with the default 777, 747 and 737. But also my first actual add-on aircraft, complex airliner, was actually the Level D Boeing 767. And I really love this plane. I mean, this is the plane that got me started into, more complex flight simulation. And this is the airplane that I first flew on VATSIM, for example. So it's really, where my flight sim career has kind of started, I really got used to the Boeing systems flying the Level D Boeing 767 in FS2004. And then later on, I got the iFly 737 and then, worked my way towards the PMDG aircraft. So it's kind of a natural thing for me, growing up with the 767, I kind of automatically, flew more Boeings. Just like other things in life, I guess, which you have been taught in the past, you're more likely to lean towards that. So for me, that's Boeing. I just grew up with it and, I still love flying it today. The second reason why I prefer Boeing aircraft is that it really takes me back to classic flying. Now, what do I mean by classic flying? Again, starting with your flight sim career, it's more likely that you do not start with the airliners, but actually fly the general aviation aircraft, which is really about pitch and power, just flying the aircraft, actual flying the aircraft, most often, using a yoke, throttle and rudder pedals. And yes, the Boeing cockpit philosophy is old, and yes, they still have the yoke and the throttles that are still moving, but I actually love that. It really reminds me of my general aviation flights in Flight Sim, and actually also my first flying lesson in real life in a Cessna 172. It are the basics there that just really appeal to me, and that even flying the 737 or the 777, even though they have very modern and advanced systems, the basics and the core is still there in in relation to an actual airplane, in regular general aviation airplane, let's say a Cessna 172, and I just love that. So the cockpit philosophy of less automation, compared to, for example, Airbus aircraft, personally more appeals to me, because I really like just the manual input and feeling what the aircraft does. Now, talking about cockpit philosophy and also the previous 2 reasons, is reason number 3, and that's that the Boeing cockpit philosophy simply appeals more to me. I know I'm not a real world pilot, I'm just a flight simmer, but it's just a feeling, even though it's just a simulator and with your little home setup you're trying this add-on airplane, you feel that one system appeals more to you than the other. And yes, maybe that has to do with my my growing up with the 767, and maybe it does have to do with the lack of Airbus experience early in my flight sim career, but it's just something I lean more towards. It feels more natural to me, and I'm sure that people who started with Airbus aircraft more early on actually have the opposite feeling and feel that Airbus makes more sense. So it's really again a time thing. Which aircraft did you study first and when? And that has a great influence, I think, on which system you prefer. Now, as you know, I've made a couple of Airbus flights, especially on VATSIM, and one of my recent VATSIM full flights flying from Zurich to Budapest was in the Airbus A319 by Aerosoft. Again, it's just a simulator, but you can definitely feel and notice the differences. Now, if I had to highlight one thing, that as a flight simmer who prefers Boeing, I think what I could mention is flying an ILS approach, or just a simple approach to a runway. Now again, tying in with the cockpit philosophy of Boeing, going back to the basics of the airplane, of the basic general aviation airplane, you know, flying in general aviation airplane like that is a lot about pitch and power. And you know, one of the early things they might teach you, you know, you use the power to adjust your altitude or your rate of descent, and you actually use your pitch in order to control your airspeed. So it's a little bit a weird way of thinking, but it does make sense once you actually sit in a cockpit or in a simulator. Now I do have to say, while flying the sim, you know, it's more of a combination of both. You know, you use both the pitch and the thrust to control both airspeed and the rate of descent. So it's kind of a mix for me personally, I think. But if you look at an fly an ILS approach, for example, you know, whereas in a Boeing aircraft, you know, where you would be flying manually most often and also with manual throttles, if you see that you're low on the glide slope, you know, you can either just pitch up, but then you'll lose some speed, but you can also add thrust to kind of decrease, you know, the rate of descent, so you can kind of catch up with the glide slope again. So it's kind of an, you know, mixture. At some point you really feel that you are in control by adjusting the pitch and the throttles accordingly. While in the Airbus, you know, that's just my personal experience. I know it's limited, so don't bash me for that. But you know, most often landings are done with auto thrust. And you know, once you are kind of below the glide slope, for example, you really have to pitch up and have to rely on the auto thrust system to add power. But that's kind of counterintuitive for me. You know, if I were to fly that same situation in a Boeing, I would just add power and a little bit of pitch at the same time. While in the Airbus, you know, you just have to follow the flight director, pitch up, and let the aircraft adjust power to maintain airspeed. Again, that's just my feeling. It might not work like that in real life, and might make more sense and maybe more easy to fly and approach in an Airbus. But that's just, you know, something that as a Boeing fan doesn't really make sense to me. So my overall personal feeling, you know, again, it's just a personal opinion, don't worry about it, is that I feel just more in control of the aircraft. Again, that may just be due to my limited experience with aircraft types like Airbus, but you know, it's just a feeling. Having those Ryokan throttles and being able to manually input those. Of course, you can also disconnect the automation in an Airbus, but still, you know, it just feels like you're more in control. That's all I gotta say. Now, the fourth reason why I prefer Boeing and prefer to take Boeing aircraft out on my VATSIM flights, for example, is that I simply have a lack of time to really study every aircraft type in detail and to, you know, get used to the workflows in those aircraft types. Now, between Boeings, it's alright. You know, switching from the 737 to the 777 is not that hard, although you will forget things, and you know, things in your workflow are just a little bit different. And you have to use an electronic checklist, for example, suddenly. So there are some subtle differences. But if you really, you know, the one week you fly Boeing and then suddenly fly Airbus, and then the other week you fly Dash 8, that's really quite difficult for me personally. I don't like that, because otherwise, you know, I'm always, you know, thinking about, oh yeah, how does this airplane work again? Now, sometimes you just want to fly and try to execute the flight properly. So usually what I do is fly a couple of weeks Boeing and a couple of weeks Dash 8 and then maybe a couple of weeks to Airbus, for example. So it really matters, you know, how much flights you actually make, because, you know, I simply cannot make enough flights to really study the Airbus, for example, in detail. Now, if I had to give you one example, you know, I flew a lot of Boeing lately, and actually the last couple of weeks I switched to the Dash 8 because, you know, I made a cold and dark startup video about it, and I just wanted to experience it a little bit more. But, you know, it's really difficult to transit to such airplane. It's quite a bit different. Of course, the basics are still the same, but, you know, the workflows, the way you have to move across the panels, you know, during the different phases of startup, for example, you know, you just forget things, and that makes it a lot difficult. And that's why I kind of lean more towards Boeing aircraft. Yeah, you could say it kind of feels safe for me, but that's fine, because, you know, sometimes, again, I just want to execute the flight properly and interact with ATC without having to think every time and again, oh yeah, how does this aircraft work again, or didn't I not forget something? Like, I've actually forgot to put in my gear in the Dash 8 during one of my last flights. And the fifth and final reason is that, you know, flying Boeing aircraft actually opens a lot of doors to flying other aircraft types. Now, this might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but you know, what I mean by this is that if you fly a Boeing 737, for example, it's very easy to transition to the 747, 757, 767, 777, 787, you know. the general layout and of course their overall philosophy is exactly the same. So it's very easy to transition to all of these aircraft types, which goes from short haul aircraft types to long haul. So it's really a great variety within the Boeing family that you can actually learn. So it does make sense for me personally to really focus on the Boeing family. However, that's actually not only the case for Boeing aircraft. I definitely think, if you take Boeing as a basis, transitioning to other aircraft types, even the Airbus, will be a lot easier. Now, even though the philosophies between all these different aircraft types is different, the main things are still the same. And especially with Boeing, it's a bit more focused on manual flying, so you kind of get to know the aircraft better, I think. And if you know the systems, from the fuel to the hydraulics to the flight management system, it's a good basis. And yes, of course, this could also work with, for example, Embraer aircraft. But I think, specifically Boeing is really focused on this classic aviation, manual flying stuff. It will allow you to just open doors to other aircraft types, either by looking up similarities or looking up differences. For example, when I learned to fly the Airbus, it's really an eye-opener. You suddenly face a totally different aircraft type. But if you have this basis of Boeing and if you discover the differences, it starts to make sense, and it will be easier to learn a new aircraft type like that. And the same goes for Embraer aircraft or the Dash 8. I found those pretty similar to Boeing, and for example, the Dash 8 is also pretty similar to Embraer in not having an auto thrust system. So you really rely, for example, during your climb and descent on manual calculations and manual adjustment of the throttle. So overall, I think the Boeing aircraft are a great standard to start with. Basically, I think it opens doors to aircraft that involve more manual flying, like the Dash 8 or the Embraer, and it opens doors to aircraft that actually are more automated, like the Airbus. Because with the more automated aircraft, you discover the differences, and with less automated and more manual aircraft, for example, without an auto throttle system, you actually discover the similarities. And having that Boeing knowledge is, in my opinion, just right in the middle, and it works very well to discover those other aircraft types. So there you go, those are my 5 reasons why I prefer Boeing aircraft, and there are a couple more, but I probably won't mention them. I think it just looks a bit better. I think the cockpit looks a little bit better, but we all have a different opinion on that, I think. So I won't go any further with other arguments. I think these reasons were my primary reasons why I prefer to fly the Boeing aircraft, specifically using VATSIM and on my VATSIM flights. So I'm sure a lot of you prefer a specific aircraft type or aircraft manufacturer, so leave down in the comments which one you prefer and why, and share some reasons why you choose a particular virtual career path. Maybe you started with Airbus and maybe you started to discover Boeing right now. What do you think of it? Please share that in the comments. I would love to hear your experiences. For now, I'd like to thank you for watching this video here on the Aviation Pro channel. Now, I have uploaded a cold and dark startup video for the Boeing 787 last Thursday, so make sure to check it out, but also on the Majestic Dash 8, so I'll try to cover every aircraft type. And if you appreciate these videos and if you like to support the channel, head over to my Patreon page, patreon.com/aviationpro. Your support would be very much appreciated. So I'd like to thank you for watching and hope to see you next time, and have fun flying your Airbus or Boeing or Dash 8 or whatever. It doesn't really matter in the end, right? It's all about flying. That's what we all like. So take care.